Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. Welcome. My name is Stephanie Duwe, and today I'm presenting my senior project for a major in Parks and Recreation Management at Northern Arizona University. Our program is Undamming the Klamath River, and this presentation is designed to give you a pretty good understanding of the ecological systems here in the Klamath River Basin. If you've never been to the Klamath River Basin, we are located here in southwestern Oregon and Northern California. This is Upper Klamath Lake and this is the Klamath River, just to focus on where we're going to be talking about. The Klamath Basin is a beautiful spot. We have the Cascade Mountains, and the Klamath Basin essentially formed from an ancient glacier. So this glacier created this glacial valley. We have the high Cascades, which are volcanoes, and today the Klamath Basin is composed of marshlands, wetlands, a large lake, and as you can see, some beautiful forests. So the high Cascades are very important here in the Klamath River Basin. We receive most of our water from the upper elevations of the high Cascades and surrounding mountain ranges. So basically, as snow melts, it eventually travels through tributaries and underground springs, feeding Upper Klamath Lake. And Upper Klamath Lake is the largest lake by surface area in the state of Oregon, and this is the headwaters of the Klamath River. So the Klamath River, as mentioned, starts at Upper Klamath Lake. So the Upper Klamath River Basin and Klamath Lake represent its headwaters, and it travels 245 miles, basically following the contour of the Cascades and the Klamath Mountains until it reaches its mouth here at the Pacific Ocean. So the river holds a variety of species. We have 83 species of fish that utilize the Klamath River Basin, and of about 83, only 45 of those are actually native. So maybe they've migrated into the river basin, maybe they were planted or stocked. And of the 83, 14 are considered endangered and listed. So we'll take a look at some of the endangered fish. We have the short-nosed sucker, which is very important through some of the indigenous communities, spiritually and physically as a food source here in the Klamath River Basin. We have the Lost River sucker, which is also very important, especially among the Klamath tribes. We have the coho salmon, which is also listed as endangered, and this salmon's important among all indigenous tribes here in the Klamath River Basin, as well as early settlers. And the Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon is actually not listed yet, so if it is listed, it'll be 15 here in the basin. But its populations have dropped so significantly that we're likely to see the Chinook salmon listed as an endangered species before long. So the river not only holds life, but it also supports life here in the Cascade Mountains and the Klamath Mountains. We have black bear, we have pine martens, and all sorts of woodland critters that you might expect to see. It supports large raptors. It's very common to walk out your door and see a bald eagle or a golden eagle or an osprey here in the Upper Klamath River Basin, as well as the Lower Klamath. And it also supports human life. So there are many indigenous communities that utilize the Klamath River Basin. Of many of them, it is the ancestral homeland of the Klamath tribes, the Yurok, the Shasta, the Hoopa, and Kurok. And for lack of time, we can't get into each culture's traditional connection to the Klamath River Basin, but I think more importantly, it's important to consider that these indigenous cultures are still here. We often talk about American Indians and their culture as something that lives in the past. But as you can see, we have the future generations of these cultures learning traditions, and it's incredibly important that we foster these ecosystems and these habitats so that our future generations can continue these traditions and live and utilize the land for not only sustenance, but also spirituality. So we're going to leave it at that, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to do research into these tribes and their connection to this landscape, because it's really neat. I mean, there's evidence that suggests the Klamath tribes have been here for over 9,000 years. So it's a very deep, intimate connection with the land, spiritually and physically. So we're going to discuss the dams on the Klamath River. Obviously, there weren't always dams on the Klamath River. And in the last 100 years, just over the last 100 years, there have been dams incorporated onto the river. So in 1906, the Bureau of Reclamation established the Klamath Project. And the Klamath Project was basically a policy that incorporated canals and ditches and dams onto the landscape, allowing for agriculture and drying up the land for ranching. So by 1965, 6 dams were constructed on the Klamath River. And today, these dams are owned by Pacific Corp, which basically provides the dams to augment water and also for electricity and power for local residents. It's really important to consider that the augmentation of water, although it's important for the livelihood of local ranchers and agriculture, as well as local residents, and the small sources of power we get from the dams, there are so many environmental impacts that we see from the dams that the benefits don't necessarily outweigh the negative. We're seeing a lot of negative impacts which do threaten the livelihood of our future generations, and that's what I'd like to prompt into. So, environmental impacts. Ever since the dams went up, we have had algae blooms, especially in modern time where we're getting warmer and warmer temperatures and the climate seems to be changing. We have cyanobacteria algae blooms, which are considered toxic and can cause skin rashes, skin irritation, liver toxicity among livestock, poisoning. So it's a big concern. And basically, as these dams hold back water in the upper Klamath and upstream, this water that was once swift warms up and it creates algae blooms. And algae blooms foster basically a habitat. So you can have worms that live in the algae, and those also can provide parasites, which impact juvenile fish. So it's a big concern. And in addition, the dam migration problem. As we have salmon migrating and other fish migrating upstream, they run into these big concrete walls. It's not the same as a big waterfall. They can't just jump into it. They basically get stuck and they can't complete their reproduction cycle. So we've seen a huge loss in fish and salmon species in the upper basin. The salmon populations that are here today are about 10% of their historic numbers. So it's a big deal. Basically, on September 19th in 2002, residents of the lower Klamath River walked outside their doors and expecting to see the beautiful Klamath River, they found a gruesome discovery. They found piles of dead fish strewn all over the riverbanks. There was, in the end, over 34,000 fish that had died. So you might think it prompted them to say, hey, we might want to study this. And the Yurok tribe prompted a study with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, among other agencies, to figure out what caused this huge die-off of fish, all these mortalities. And they discovered that itch, which is a parasite, was present, as well as columnars, which we'll talk about. Itch is a parasite that basically causes white spots on the scales and skin of fish. It attacks the fish gills, and its oxygen processes no longer operate and the fish perishes. Columnaris is very similar, but it's a bacteria, and that bacteria causes rotting of the gills, which obviously causes a loss in oxygen processes too. So those two things are not uncommon in the basin, but when you have a lot of fish who seem stressed, the pathogens spread like wildfire, if you will, and that caused over 34,000 fish to die. So the study concludes that in 2002, a large group of Chinook salmon entered the lower Klamath, and they didn't migrate upstream. It could have been due to mixing of temperatures, but at the point of them not migrating, all these fish were in one location, and it caused a lot of stress, allowing these pathogens to pass very rapidly. And evidence shows that the Iron Gate Dam, its flow rates were much lower than they have been in the past. So we presume that if the dams had produced the actual historic flow rates instead of holding back water for agricultural purposes, among other things, these fish wouldn't have died. So this was a big deal in 2002. It prompted the support of removing the dams and upholding indigenous traditions and culture, but also thinking about how are we leaving this place for our future generations. So in 2006, Pacific Corp, the owner of the dam's license, expired, and in order to renew it, they were faced with having to comply with modern environmental regulations. So the following year, in 2007, they had to incorporate fish ladders on 2 of the dams. So in 2008, a draft to remove the dams was submitted, and basically it was for the Klamath River restoration project because of the water was in just such poor quality. But it wasn't until November 2008 that the United States, the state of California, state of Oregon, and Pacific Corp got together, and they agreed that it was more cost effective than trying to maintain the dams to remove 4 of the dams on the Klamath River, which was a huge victory. So this will be the first time in almost a century, or over a century, that the water in the upper Klamath Lake and the Klamath River will actually be improving versus degrading. And this removal will be funded through the state of California and the state of Oregon, as well as other federal resources. And something to note too, 2 of the dams aren't going to be removed, but when we go back and talk about those alterations that Pacific Corp made, these 2 dams were the ones with fish ladders. So we think that it will allow fish to continue migrating and getting up to the upper Klamath Basin, which seems impossible in this day and age. You might wonder, okay, well, if you're going to get rid of the dams, what about power? And that's something that Pacific Corp considered. In order to compensate for the loss of electricity and power, they are going to propose incorporating more sustainable ways of retrieving power, such as solar, wind, and renewable energy. So if this project proves successful, the legislation and the overall dam removal process will potentially pave the way for future dam removal. And we might start seeing a new wave of environmental policy when it comes to rivers. And it's huge when we think about our future generations. So in conclusion, removing the dams on the Klamath River are not going to solve all of our problems here in the basin. We have climate change, which is resulting in less snowpack, which is causing drought. But if we start taking steps to work to be stewards of this landscape and taking care of our home, we're leaving our future generations with something more than algae blooms and dead fish. So I appreciate your time, and I hope that you learned something new about the Klamath River Basin or the policies in place, and I look forward to potentially seeing you out this way. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will provide that in the links. So thanks again. Take care. Be well.